So our next speaker is Anna Dining, who earned a bachelor's in motion picture science from Rochester Institute of Technology. And in the time since her paper was accepted for this conference, she became an employee of Technicolor, working as a support engineer for on-location services. The fact that I'm a Technicolor employee had nothing to do with that. Anna?
Okay. Hello. Hello, Tuesday attendees. I'm glad you were able to make it out here and be a part of this active discussion of the language that is evolving for immersive storytelling. So over the past year, while completing my degree at Rochester Institute of Technology, I was immersing my mind in immersive media, specifically visual immersion. I wanted to approach the hype of the emerging technology with kind of a grounded scientific sensibility. Unlike many talks at this conference, my paper and my presentation are not about the technology itself, but they're about how to consciously create stories and compose research with the current state of technology in a manner that will maintain its applicability to technology as it evolves in the future. So I created 3 variations of an immersive narrative story. I used 4096 by 2160 monoscopic 360 video viewed in an HTC Vive. I agree this is not the true virtual reality, nor it's the ideal quality for viewing experience, but it's what's accessible for creation and distribution now. And with a captivating story, the quirks of where advanced technology is not at the moment can be overlooked by a well-told story. So I also believe that working with 360 video now and studying visual immersion and the language around it can permit research to build as the technology enhances, so then thoughtful quality content can grow with technology. So the title of my paper is A User Study of Story Presence in an Immersive Narrative Experience Tested with Various Levels of Immersion. So that's a really long title. So I found 2 kind of key phrases. Story presence and perspective really summarize most of my research. So presence is the 360 first-person point of view provided by a complete visual immersion. There is no frame, but there is perspective. And then we come to story presence. So story presence is a sensation of presence, not only being there within the story environment, but also within the story narrative itself. Story presence isn't just tied to immersive media. Story presence is experienced in all forms of storytelling media. In traditional cinema, you use composition and editorial to achieve an emotional connection to the story and kind of presence inside of it. Same with literature, use literary tools and kind of lengthy page-long novels to immerse a reader into the story. And then we come and we have immersive stories. So the main question is when to use visual immersion, when to use this medium to tell your story. Well, simply put, some stories are meant to be read, some stories are meant to be played in video games, some stories are meant to be shown and told in traditional cinema, and some stories are meant to be experienced. So that's when you would want to use immersive stories. Once you choose, you probably want to tell your story with a visual medium. You have different tools, again, in your toolbox that you can use. We're familiar in this conference with the range of color gamut, frame rate, visual immersion, and dynamic range. I want to kind of add visual immersion to the set of tools for discussion. Okay. So once you decide that you want to tell a visually immersive story, you're probably moving from traditional cinema to visually immersive storytelling. Here's a pretty simple bridge. This is actually a false illustration. It's not that simple. It's not a straight path from one to the other. Rather, it's pretty complicated, and there's a lot more steps to it. So with this desire to explore visual storytelling, I decided to create a user study. So at the beginning, I needed to explore the tools of visual immersion, and then after exploring and defining this vocabulary, I needed a narrative experience to test. So there aren't many narrative experiences out there with variant levels of immersion, so I created one myself. I used a presence questionnaire to determine the success of the different tools used for visual immersion. So presence in kind of the first emergence of virtual reality was used to test virtual environments for success for training purposes, but I kind of took the questionnaires from how they were applied in the 90s and transformed them to apply to a storytelling experience. And then I ran a batch of user testing with 75 participants, and they each randomly were selected to experience one of my 3 versions of my story. And then I analyzed my results and will conclude what I learned. So for the language of immersive storytelling, some of these I've touched on already, but one key thing is immersion. So what is immersion? It's the objective term related to the technology that permits a sensation of presence. You do not feel immersed, you are immersed, and you feel present. And so when you're feeling present by being immersed, you are experiencing the subjective sensation of being there. This broad term of presence is commonly subcategorized into spatial presence, mental presence, involvement, emotional, and then story presence. Story presence isn't taken from other research. It's what I've used in my study, as I feel like it applies to transitioning from cinematic storytelling into visually immersive storytelling. So as I previously stated, story presence is the sensation of not just being there in the space, but in the story itself. It's feeling the emotions of the story as if you were there in that story event. And then the last 3, I have my 3 E's, which are my kind of classifications of visually immersive stories. We have the environment, which is the visuals used to construct an experience. So this is how was the experience, or how were the visuals generated. So this can be 360 video, or it can be 3D generated. If it's 3D generated, it's either trying to be replicating the real world, so trying to be photorealistic and CGI, whereas it can also be 3D generated and trying to replicate an abstract world, so animation, where your sense of presence in a world that doesn't exist is a different consideration than your sense of presence in an animated or a generated world that's trying to look real. So then we have existence. So existence touches back to one of my key terms of perspective. So you can either exist actively or passively in the story. So an active perspective would be you are viewing inside the story with full visual immersion as a character. You are treated with an identity. You have some active existence in the story. Passive existence and passive perspective would be like a fly on the wall. And that's actually the closest to cinema as we know it. We watch it with a selection of edits and cuts from different angles, which there might be a point of view shot in there, but most of the time it's from a passive perspective. And then we come to experience. So experience is your experience inside of the story. So it's your level of agency. And agency is on my other paper. So agency describes your ability to change your experience of the story. So agency is your interaction. For my study, I kind of classified it as a binary. You either have no agency or you have agency. This is actually a spectrum, and you could probably refer to the slides from the previous presentation on that. But no agency would be you have no interaction, you have no ability to change the story. And then with agency refers to a participant's active ability to interact with the story, either locally or globally. So local agency means you can change minor things in the scene, but you're not changing really like the outcome of the story, where global agency is changing the direction of the story. There's a good podcast by Kent Bai where he describes this as riding on a train. So local agency is when you are on that train and you're able to walk around between different cars. You can look out the window from different points of view, but your train is still going to the same destination. Whereas global agency is if you kind of change the track of that train and the final outcome. I will only explore local agency in my user study. Okay, so I came up with all of that classification before I created an experience for myself. So I needed to tell an immersive story. The story I created was called You're My Best Friend, and it's the story of a young boy, Luke, and his imaginary best friend, Hoover. The story goes through kind of his imaginary world, and it follows him as he grows up and stops believing in his imagination and his imaginary friend. You can think boyhood, Toy Story, plus an obsession with owls meets visual immersion. In the story, as you could see in the doorway, there's also a mother figure, so she's another primary character. So we have Luke, his imaginary friend, which is an owl that sits in the wagon. Long story short, the owl's in the wagon because it's an injured owl and Luke is trying to heal it. I had to create an imaginary world for my story. So the owl can be identified by being in the wagon. And then the mother is kind of always looking over lovingly, but also concerned about Luke's obsession with his imaginary friend and kind of disregard for reality. So that's the story I used. I won't go into it too much, but I put a lot of effort into the art direction and into creating a story that is told in the full 360. So if you're not watching the character, you could be looking in little nooks in the room and you're getting a piece of his character. You're seeing books that he's read and toys and notes that he's written. So you get little bits of the story even if you're not watching the main action. Okay. So this is where the user study really jumps in. So for this story, you can see I only used 360 video because that is where my skill set is. So we had the fly on the wall perspective, which is a passive existence, and there was no agency, so no ability to interact with the story. You had active with no agency, so this is where the camera was as a character. I shot my story from 3 different perspectives, as the passive fly on the wall, as Hoover, the imaginary friend, and as the mother, so another character. So you have active, no agency, and then active with agency. And the agency that they have is to be able to switch between 2 different character perspectives. So what this permits them is sometimes the characters are in different rooms, so they're experiencing different parts of the story. I'll go into an example in a bit, but it allows you to have the emotions connected to the mother, so you can kind of see from a point of view that's loving and concerned, and you can see from Hoover, who experiences Luke's excitement and kind of friendship. So you get a broader sense of emotions in the story. So here's an illustration of just cropped versions of the 3 different captured perspectives. I captured all of these at different, they were not captured simultaneously, so I had to concentrate a lot on control and consistency within the scenes because they needed to be as consistent and controlled as possible, so that when you switch between the mother and Hoover's perspective, it's the same point in the story. So here's an example of the passive with no agency. So passive with no agency you can see in one room there's a mother talking with another mother. This is a friend's birthday party. Luke is in the corner, and as a fly on the wall, you're kind of able to see both characters, but you're not kind of interacted with. We have active with no agency, so for the ANA version, you were only Hoover. So again, you were not given a controller to switch perspectives, but you had one consistent identity throughout the entire experience, which was beneficial for certain presence questions. So in this scene, again, it's the birthday party scene, so you're experiencing Luke interacting with you directly, but you can still glance to the side and see the mothers in the other room. And then when you're able to control and change between the two perspectives, this is active with the agency, with that local agency. So you're able to switch and jump into the kitchen where the parents are having a conversation, a serious adult conversation about their concern for Luke's kind of wild imagination and how he doesn't like to hang out with the other kids. And then you can jump to Hoover's perspective and just see a happy child playing with his imaginary friend. So I had these 3 versions, and I thought I skipped a slide. So then I needed a way to test how was each one successful. So this is why I chose a presence questionnaire. Again, presence questionnaires were used in the 90s by Slater, Uso, and let's see. Yeah, Slater, Uso, and Stein, Whitmer, and Singer, and there was an I-group presence questionnaire. I mostly took my structure from the I-group presence questionnaire, which was testing virtual environments, and it categorized presence in spatial, mental, or involvement, and realism. Realism doesn't really apply to my experience, so I created the 3rd category as story presence. You could see the users responded on a scale of 1 to 7. So a higher score means they felt more present in that present type. For spatial presence, if you kind of use some of these, they're very repetitive, and that's on purpose because when testing a subjective concept like presence, repetition is necessary in case the person didn't fully understand such a subjective statement. Okay, so my user study, I tested 75 participants. There was 14 questions. They were given one of the 3 variations at random. They viewed it on the HTC Vive. Only if they had the agency version were they given the remote controller to switch between perspectives. And then they answered my presence questionnaire afterwards. So here's some results for the general presence. The general presence question really just asked about their general sense of being there in the place, and it had them rate it from 1 to 7. As you can see, it was common through all of my responses that active with agency and active with no agency seemed to be higher than the passive with no agency. So this meaning that active perspectives really are more powerful in inducing a sense of presence and maximizing the use of visual immersion. So here in spatial presence, I received a lot of high presence scores. This was the highest where there's a lot of responses above 6. For example, spatial presence 1 question to the left asked, I felt like the room surrounded me. All of these mean responses were above 6. And I think this is related to when it's asking, I felt like the room surrounded me, this ties more to the objective quality of they were actually visually immersed in the technology rather than kind of the subjective sense of story. And then we have results from involvement presence. The involvement presence is kind of about how mindful they felt and how involved they were in the experience, as in ignoring any other thoughts or sounds in the room. Yeah. And for involvement presence 2, for example, that question asked, I was completely captivated by the experience, and it asked them to agree or disagree. So in involvement presence 2, you see the active with agency. is higher than the no agency versions. So when you're completely captivated by experience, I think that the agency really helped them ignore anything else that was going on. They were thinking about when am I going to change perspectives, and they were kind of interacting with the two perspectives, which allowed them to be more involved within the story. And then for story presence, for example, story presence 1, we have to what extent were there times during the experience when the story was a reality for you? So for this one, the active with no agency was higher slightly than active with agency, and it's likely related to, or both of those were high, likely related to the fact that they were characters in the story. So you were able to feel more present within the story because you were actually treated as a character within the story. I'm kind of breezing through these. If you want to go through my paper, I analyze each of the questions. I just want to leave room for any questions from the audience. So for my conclusions, here is a graph I have that shows the average score for spatial involvement and story presence. As you can see, the active with agency triangle, the pink one, and the active with no agency are kind of competing along the scale. There's no true statistical significance or statistical difference between the active with agency and the active with no agency. And what this really means is that we should continue to explore agency and the absence of agency, because some stories will benefit from one consistent perspective, whereas others will benefit from the ability to move around and explore different perspectives and points of view within the story. And overall, active was better than passive, but I do want to say that we can just, as long as your perspectives are purposeful. For example, Hoover at the end of the story became a passive character because Luke never referred to him as a friend. He was just pushed in the corner with his wagon. And the mother at times was passive. She was just watching in the doorway. But they still had an active existence, just were passive at times. So as long as you're purposeful with the perspectives that you're choosing, then you can create a meaningful story with successful presence scores for your participants. And any comments or questions? Yes.
Could you reiterate the difference between passive and active in this context?
So in this context, it's an active or passive perspective, so your existence. So passive would be a fly on the wall. No one is interacting with you. You do not exist in the story. Whereas active is you are a part of the story. You are a character. You are called by a name. Yeah.
Could you comment on the story itself and its engagement with your audience versus the extra use of virtual reality?
So my specific story?
Yeah. The score on your general score across all your graph indicated that maybe the story was still the most important part.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time creating a story where there was no big climax, but it really relied on subtle emotions and kind of subtle shifts within the characters, and that you were really able to understand by kind of being a character. Like as the imaginary friend, you saw him grow distant from you. As the mother, you experienced him growing up. I had people after the experience saying they liked one over the other, or they liked switching between the perspectives. Many people really liked having a character and being a character in the story rather than the passive fly on the wall. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you have considered anything as far as the participants in the seat, as far as how that seat changes their passive ability to turn around and be fully immersed, and what can change as far as setting them on the ground, letting them stand, putting them in a swivel chair, little things like that, and how that changes.
They were in a swivel chair. I did not have them stand just because I've displayed a lot of different 360 experiences, and people tend to walk around and move through the space in a way that the technology is not going to change. So staying in a seat, it allowed them to spin around, and that was really they weren't able to move in the scene, so just kept it controlled.
Is that content available anywhere, perchance?
It is not currently,
You might
yeah,
consider that if possible.
yes.